and welcome to Liverpool Online Music and this edition of It's All Just Music, ain't it?
No, it's not.
Now, as you probably guessed, look, the studio audience are reacting. As you probably guessed, that, you know, you all know me as Liam Boone, but the other man in the room is clearly Mr. Phil Beale, who loves his interjections. Is that the right word? Interjection.
Right
he loves his interjections, and some of the studio ones have nodded off already.
Sorry, everybody. Yeah.
Lady with the red hat. No, I've been handed a few notes from people in the studio audience. They just wanted to, I don't know what. This one's interesting. It says, "Why don't you two old twats get?" I don't know who wrote that, but it's not funny. I've got another one here. Oh, my nan's in. Oh, God, there's my nan. She's 104.
All right, Nan.
And she sent me a message, and it says quite simply, "Don't slouch on the couch." All right, Nan, thanks for that. I don't know what you're laughing at. She said, "Tell your couch potato mate as well," didn't you, Nan? Doesn't it say that there, Nan? Anyway, on with the show.
Welcome,
now, as
everyone.
you know, our those of you, thousands of you who watch us every week, the format of the show is basically we take a decade out of the last 100 years and we have a look at the musical trends, what was going on in music, blah, 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 this, that, and the other, in that 10-year period. I usually start off by saying, do we need to do all that? Because it's all just music, isn't it? And then Phil, or Professor Phil as I call him sometimes, he gags in and says, well, actually, there's more to it than that. And I say, well, go on then, persuade me. And to be honest with you, you know, 7 times out of 10, they call it 6, let's round it to 5.
Well,
occasionally,
half
the time, it does actually persuade me that there's more to be looked into than just, you know, turning the music on, turning it off, and having a laugh and having a dance. Okay, so in this edition, we're looking at the 1960s.
Oh.
What a fantastic time, according to the way, you know, it's relayed to us in musical history. Probably one of the greatest decades in the history of music. But
Perception
yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Now, I remember it, but I was only a little kid. I think I was only about age 5 when the 60s started.
Okay, right.
You're in a much better position because you were in your late 30s.
That's cheeky.
Oh, the studio audience liked that, didn't you? Come on. Why don't they clap and shout, the studio audience? We'll have to have a word with them after the show. Okay, so let's say me and you were actually kids.
We were.
Okay, so what you're going to get in our recollections of the 60s is partly what we've know and learn about it as adults now. We can look back. Yes. But you're going to get a lot of stuff from us that is about our childhood recollections of the 60s.
Yeah.
You know, for example, I was 5 in 1962.
Okay.
And I started school, and as you do on your first day, you think, oh, I want to go home and all that kind of stuff. But there was some girls who were only a year older, so they might have been only 6 or 7, and they were playing a game with 2 balls. Now, just let me qualify that. They were playing a game with 2 tennis balls.
Okay.
And they do like a juggling game, and they throw the balls up against the wall, dum-de-dum-de-dum, and they were singing, "Love, love me do."
Oh, wow.
I know.
That's amazing.
I love you. So that was my initiation first day at school. I thought, oh yeah, this is going to be okay, I think.
Yeah.
And then a group of boys came over and tried to rob the tennis balls. Then the boys tried to out-sing or drown the girls out, and they were singing something like the Dave Clark 5.
Yeah.
Baby, I'm glad all over. Baby, I'm glad all over.
Feeling glad all over. Glad was a lucky girl.
Yeah.
Hey,
and I think there's a lot of euphemisms.
I'll leave the jokes to you.
I'm not sure what glad all over really means. Yes, okay, darling, just sit down again. We'll talk about that later. So that's my first day to school. And that was 62, and I was like, wow, you know. So what I tried to work out, and I look back because I really missed it as a child, is, and this sounds like a daft question, when did the 60s, as we refer to them as in history of music, when did the 60s kind of start? Now, I know you could say, well, it started on New Year's Day.
No, it didn't.
No, it didn't.
It's a really good question.
So when you know, you're the historian, you know, when did it actually kick in?
Well, again, we've got to stress we're speaking almost exclusively really from a UK perspective.
Yeah.
And you know, it would have been closer to New Year's Day 1963 in actual fact than 1960, because the early 60s were still hung over from the petering out of the rock and roll explosion, which started with Elvis in the States in 1956, obviously. So the energy of that had pretty much run dry. Elvis had joined the army in 58 and came out a completely different animal in 1960. And the music scene had really, really blanded itself completely out by that point. So we were still enthralled to the States, but the States was producing rubbish, quite frankly. It's the era of the Bobbies, Bobby Vinton, Bobby V, Bobby this.
There's a lot of Bobbies.
A lot of Bobbies, and they all looked the flipping same. They all sounded the same. Yeah. And the music was pap. It was mass-produced. It came from professional songwriters, not from the artists themselves in most cases. The only real exception to that, the only honourable exception to that in the UK, believe it or not, was Billy Fury, the honourable Billy Fury.
Billy Fury from Liverpool.
Absolutely,
yeah.
And he wrote his own music,
right?
And he was a standout in that sense at that time.
Yeah.
So the real revolution really was with the Beatles. Sure. Again, we're in the greatest city in the world here, and they're a big part of the reason for that. That it is the greatest city in the world. But Not Love Me Do come out in '62. Hey, as you say. It was a minor hit, really, in terms of the UK as a whole. Locally, it was massive because everybody knew them as a local band. You know, I think it reached about 15 on the national charts. So it wasn't a revolution. Their appearance, though, was revolutionary. They looked completely different with their long hair, which really was a massive change from, because again, up to them, everybody was wearing quiffs and DAs, looking like teddy boys.
I can remember seeing old pictures of the Beatles when they were playing in Hamburg.
They were themselves,
and they were leather jackets and pointy shoes, the quiffs and everything. And that's how my older relatives, my uncles seemed dead old to me, but when I was 5, they were probably only in their 20s, and they would wear like a leather jacket with the collar up, and they'd have a quiffed haircut, and
that's
they'd have
right.
drain pipe jeans, and they were still like that in the early 60s.
They were.
So I was trying to. So would you say 1963?
62 was the transitional year.
Right. Okay. So is that when the Beatles manager Brian Epstein said, "Look, lads, if you really want to make it,"
it's the year he started having a big influence on them,
and he changed the hairstyles and he started wearing.
That's right. Now they got the idea for that hairstyle, which was pretty, which hadn't been seen before in Hamburg, as it happened.
Right.
So that would have been probably 61 / early 62. They were still playing in Hamburg in 61.
Right.
I think they finished their Hamburg stints in early 62 actually. Yeah. But it was during that time that they spotted these German youngsters, teenagers that were coming to watch them, and they called themselves X's.
X's, okay, yeah.
They call themselves X's, yeah. So they were a group of students, really, that were studying existentialism, and they had their very own look, and that hairstyle was very much part of that. Right. So people like Jürgen Vollmer and Astrid Kirchherr, and who's the bass player? The bass player's name, it escapes me for the moment.
He was also a painter and artist.
He was. He created the Revolver. No. Talking about the German.
The German guy. Okay.
Sorry, Klaus Vormann was his name.
Klaus Vormann.
So these were a bunch of mates, friends who focused. They spotted the Beatles playing in Hamburg, and they became huge fans, and they influenced each other. So they were very, very. They were educated. They were opinionated, and they were not your traditional German kind of image of somebody. They really bonded together. Astrid and Stuart Sutcliffe became a partnership, and he stayed over there. He was an artist primarily, as you say. He was a bass player who faced the back of the stage because he couldn't really play.
Oh, I see.
So, but he did that as a favour to John Lennon, who wanted him in the band.
Yeah.
He was primarily an artist and a really, really a fabulously gifted artist. So it was an artistic scene over there. But the influence of their image influenced the Beatles in turn. And while they were over there, they started getting their hair cut. The only one that wouldn't was Pete Best, because he thought it looked stupid.
And he kept the old style quiff.
He did.
So the Beatles are they're still initially playing kind of, rock and roll music and so on.
Yeah.
And they changed their look, the collarless suit.
That's right.
Tie.
That's right.
And that haircut
Absolutely.
and everything.
Absolutely.
Okay, so...
the suits was a bone of contention.
Right.
And they hated dropping their leather jacket look
right.
And going a bit more conventional to start with. They kicked up a bit of a fuss, but they understood the logic behind it.
Sure.
So that was Epstein's influence. He took over, as I say, I think it was 1961 he started managing them. He was a massive figure on the Liverpool scene at the time.
Absolutely, yeah. He did manage quite a few bands, didn't he?
It was more than that, though. He was a recognised businessman.
Yeah.
So in societal terms, his family were behind the NEMS,
the big music
stores,
shops,
and they were furniture stores originally.
Right. Okay.
They got into music because they started stocking radiograms,
of course,
which was furniture, but of course it included a record player. So Brian, being more artistic than business necessarily, said, "Well, I'd like to open a record department to complement the record players that we're selling."
Right.
And that's how that kind of started out. So he then more and more concentrated on the musical side of the business, and it became one of their stores became was it on Whitechapel, I believe?
Yeah.
That's right, isn't it?
Yeah, and they sold pianos and all sorts of stuff,
and records particularly.
So, but at what point? Okay, so we've got the Beatles with new haircuts. They're wearing these suits, which they're not too keen on, but they'll go for it, see how it works out, kind of thing.
Yep.
But they were playing basically rock and roll, doing it well actually. They were good at it. So, at what point did the music cease to be the rock and roll of the 50s and become the thing of the 60s? Because we had something called the Mersey beat, and I'm just trying to work out what did they add to or take away from rock and roll that developed that new style. First
of all, initially they was doing what everybody else was doing. Every other band, it was a hotbed of music was Liverpool and the surrounding areas. But the bands were all playing the same songs, so then you get to a venue with maybe 3 or 4 bands on the bill.
Yeah.
And you'd be maybe top of the bill.
Yeah.
And halfway through the night, they've played all our songs. So
right.
So that drove them, and they obviously were inherently creative people, to start trying to write their own, because that meant that your repertoire wouldn't be nicked halfway through the night.
Apparently, at the height of the 60s, there was 350 working bands operating in Liverpool.
Absolutely amazing.
And you could go to some bars or clubs and see 3 or 4 bands starting at 6 o'clock in the evening, going right through to the end. And, there was many bands that played at 3 or more venues in the one night.
That's right. Yeah, the Beatles are one of them.
And
the Beatles are one of them.
Because a friend of one of my uncles, he was a taxi driver, but he also had a van. And all night he'd be ferrying bands around. And he said he remembers picking the Beatles up from Dovedale Towers by Penny Lane, dropping them off in Walton, then picking up someone else, I don't know, Jerry and the Pacemakers, dropping them off at the wrong place, having to go back with them. He said, wonder he got any sleep. But yeah, it was mayhem. 350 bands all trying to get gigs in Liverpool.
The scene was so vibrant, that's right.
It was fantastic. And as you say, if you went out for a night out and you went out for 2 or 3 hours, you might see 5 or 6 bands, and the chances are that those bands might have to start repeating.
That's right.
The favourite songs.
Inevitably.
People wanted to dance to those bands.
Absolutely.
Didn't they?
And the covers that they were doing were rock and roll. They were rock and roll standards,
absolutely,
obviously.
Yeah.
So that's right. So, but then the Beatles started to change that through necessity, and then started to believe as much in their own material.
Sure.
It took a while,
right? Yeah.
As they did in the stuff that was influencing them. Other influences as well were important in their makeup. It wasn't just rock and roll. McCartney brought into the setup a lot of influences from music hall and from his father, his father had been a dance band, jazz band leader in his own right. So that's why there was always a piano in their house. Why that's how Paul learned piano. His dad bought him a trumpet initially. That's the first instrument he ever had. Yeah. And then he suddenly realised, hang on, I can't sing and play.
I play the trumpet. Tricky.
But Paul brought those different influences in, which became part of the 60s structure.
Right.
That kind of musical kind of image and style of music. Other bands took it up and ran with it. I can't remember the names now, but they'll come to me if we talk further about it. But so they were quite a unique blend of influences anyway. The rock and roll was massively important to them, but they also had other things going on. So that that again, that writing your own material was crucial. And when they went into the studios with George Martin initially, he wanted them. One of the songs he wanted them to cover was "How Do You Do It?" Believe it or not,
right.
And they hated it.
Oh.
So he said to them, because they'd done "Love Me Do" at this point, which was their own composition, obviously. He said to them, "You're going to do that, or if you're not going to do it, you're going to have to go away and bring me a song that's better than that. Right. Otherwise, you're doing it, and we're putting it out as your next single." Right. So they were really up against a major problem at this point. They did not want to do Mitch Murray's "How Do You Do It," and they went away and they created "Please Please Me," which had started out as almost a waltz time sort of Roy Orbison type thing. Yeah. Please, please me. That's how Leonard originally written in homage to Roy Orbison.
Right.
But that wasn't working. So they basically upped the tempo, changed the time signature, came back in and said, right, this is what we want to release. They played him Please, Please Me, and he said, "You've just written your first #1," and he wasn't wrong. And that's when it literally exploded in early 1963 with the release of that song. So that was the explosion. All of a sudden, long hair was the thing. Yeah. Everybody wanted to either come from Liverpool or speak like a Liverpoolian. Yeah. It was so huge as an impact.
So there's a lot of stuff going on there that seems to be about identity or the change of identity. You know, the established look of the 50s and rock and roll with the leather jackets and the quiffs, that was up for change. The music was changing.
That's right.
People were trying to form their own identity.
That's right.
Rather than be associated with something that already existed.
That's correct.
And the Beatles, although they were a bit reluctant at first, when Brian Epstein said, "You're all getting these suits," you know, they said, "I'll give it a try." And the next thing, you know, they're writing their own. Now, it was interesting that at one point, George Martin said, "Here's a great song, you're going to record it." And they said, "No, we're not." A lot of bands would have said, "No, okay."
Well, Jerry and the Pacemakers obviously did, because they then took that song and took it to #1.
And took it to #1.
That's right, yeah.
But the Beatles saying, "No, we write our own stuff."
Yes.
So that's also about identity. And that's also about saying we're not...
we're different.
We're not linked with what's been happening. We're now linked with something that is about to happen.
Absolutely.
And we're in on the beginning of making it happen. So that's the beginning of a kind of, if you like, the revolutionary 60s, and that's about 1960.
63 it came out.
63, right.
What that created was exactly the same impact as Elvis had in 1956.
Right.
A little bit later over here, he came over a bit later than that. But once Elvis arrived, everything else that had preceded Elvis's music and rock and roll was completely irrelevant.
Right.
What happened when the Beatles landed with the single album "Please Please Me," everything else that preceded that was utterly irrelevant.
Yeah,
it was old. It had had its day.
Yeah.
This is the future.
Right.
And suddenly, it almost feels like Britain turned from black and white to colour.
Yeah, yeah.
In that moment,
yeah, and it was a big bang in all sorts of ways. Not only in terms of, you know, the hairstyles, the clothes, and the colour, and the way people looked and behaved, and you know, the language. Obviously, the music is the main thing we're talking about.
That's right.
Major sort of change there in terms of how people got their music and what they wanted to listen to.
That's right.
And whereas previously, music seemed to be all about, you know, short, sharp, punchy hit songs. Right. Now, a minute ago, you mentioned LP, and in the same breath, you mentioned album, and I'm thinking, hang on, aren't they the same thing? Isn't an LP an album?
It is.
Is the main difference, the way I see it, tell me if I've got this wrong, is that an LP is just a big record with a load of songs on.
Right.
Yeah, quick, let's put 10 or 12 songs on this and sell it.
Yes.
But an album is a bit more like you've sat down and said, let's make an album. Yeah. So am I right in saying that when all these changes were happening in 1963, was really, we can trace that back to the beginning of albums rather than LPs.
Definitely, because LPs up to that point were literally a collection of singles, B-sides, which were just fillers anyway in most cases. Yeah. And if they haven't got enough to make 14 tracks, 7 aside, then they'd chuck any old rubbish on there to get it to the.
And there was EPs as well, wasn't there?
EPs, yeah.
EPs were the size of a 45, but they had a few extra tracks on.
Now again, until the Beatles arrived, I mean, they were fairly spurious, but the Beatles EPs were a story of their own, really.
Sure, yeah.
They included some covers on their EPs, which were on their albums. Their singles weren't on their albums to start with,
Right.
or after Please Please Me anyway. They produced singles which were just, you know, that was it. You got a single, and then you bought the album. There's a load more stuff on there, you know.
Yeah,
so they changed that medium too. Really, they radically changed the medium. And other bands then started to follow. The Stones came shortly afterwards with their first album was all covers.
Right.
It was all blues covers and R&B covers. I think that came out in I think they landed in '65. I think. But then Andrew Loog Oldham. We'll come on to another aspect of that in a second. But Andrew Loog Oldham, their manager, said, "Right, guys, the Beatles are writing all their own material." In fact, their second single, I think it was a Beatles track. It was "I Want to Be Your Man."
I want to be your man.
Exactly.
Yeah,
So "I Want to Be Your Man" was
brilliant.
written by Lennon and McCartney for Ringo to sing on stage. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, but they hadn't quite completed it when they bumped into Mick Jagger and Keith Richards in London, and they literally bumped into them on the street and had a chat. And Jagger and Richards said, we're looking for some material. Have you got anything we can have? And they said, well, we just finished one off. They went down to one of the the clubs somewhere in Soho, sat down and finished it off and said, there you go, guys, try that. Yeah. And they took "I Want to Be Your Man" to number one, I think the Stones did. So that was the beginning of their career. But Andrew Loog Oldham said after that, look, you've got to do what they're doing, guys, otherwise you're going to die. You are going to die. Yeah. And he locked them, the legend is that he locked them in the kitchen and said, you ain't coming out until you've got me a song. Right. And they came out with "The Last Time," which is just such a brilliant song. But that's how that's the legend of how that was created. So that was the revolution. It was moving away from just being a performer. Yeah. Whose first name was probably Bobby. Sure, yeah. To being something much more artistic.
Okay, so it sounds like we're saying that up until around about 1963, what most bands were doing was playing from a repertoire of well-known, established songs that would enable people in the clubs and bars to get up and have a dance. And the best you could hope for is we played these songs slightly better than this other band, and more people dance to us and that, and the other. That's right. But in about 63-ish with the Beatles, when bands started writing their own songs, okay, some of them are still trying to write catchy hits. But I think what was also going on to do with identity was that the songwriters were saying, listen to this song we've written. Yes. Don't just get up and dance to the beat and the speed and the time and then sit down again and chat to your mates. Actually listen to this. So it's almost like the Beatles were moving into a part of their career where they wanted people to listen to them more. That's right. And maybe we're more inclined to think of performing live as being more like a concert rather than just playing a gig. Because I think the Beatles had some incredible gigs they did where there were so many people screaming and shouting and everything that the Beatles couldn't hear. That's right. Couldn't hear themselves. That's right. That's right. Their monitors, they couldn't hear themselves playing. That's right. And after that experience, they thought, well, we want to write stuff that people listen to. Well, the Beatles radically, they just completely revolutionised the whole business. So the actual staging of the gigs at the start of the decade, Bobby V would go into a cinema somewhere and he'd be using the house PA. Right, it'd be coming out of the bloody speakers all around the building. It was that's how rudimentary PAs were. Sure. When you get to the Beatles, they've got such a volume of people that want to hear them that they created touring, they created stadium gigs. They really did revolutionise the whole business, but all on the back of the strength of the songwriting. Ultimately. Sure, absolutely, yeah. But yes, you're right. Yeah. They wanted people to listen to what they were saying. Yeah. And that obviously, to begin with, every song they sang or wrote was about they were late teenagers themselves. They were going through all those emotional turmoil that we all do. So all their first songs were about girls, weren't they? Or love, or she loves you, and they actually wrote "She Loves You" as it happens. A case in point. She loves you. They tried to find a different angle on either "I love you" or "You love me" or "I've lost you" or whatever. So maybe do a third person singular kind of approach this. She loves you, not I love you. She loves you, and that the phrasing, a revolution. She loves you was a common phrase in school playgrounds. Because lads would always be nudging the mate saying, she loves you, she doesn't, she does. I've actually seen film of Anfield
There's a famous clip of Anfield from '64. I think it must have been '63 or '64. And they're singing it on the Cop.
Yeah, absolutely.
Amazing, absolutely amazing.
Yeah.
This stuff is like revolutionary, you know. So It was a real youth quake. It genuinely was a youth quake.
So the Beatles, okay, we're saying the Beatles were a major thing that happened in the 60s. You know, for you, other bands that were happening at the same time, maybe they didn't get quite the same headlining, quite the same status, but had relevant, you know, influence and impact on the music of the 60s. Who are the other bands in your mind around about the Beatles who were making an impact?
Well, that's a very good question. Yeah. Because there were a lot of copyists.
Right.
There were a lot of other artists that were still just producing or just still singing other people's work.
Of course,
like Jerry and the Pacemakers, for example. Dave Clark 5. I'm not sure if they wrote their own stuff or not. It was an image thing though as much as anything else. So a huge image changeover, like we'd already talked about. The look was crucial, and something else we wanted to talk about was that when the Stones landed, they were actually a 6-piece band when they landed.
Oh, right.
So they've got Brian Jones and Keith Richards on guitars, Bill Wyman on bass, Charlie, the divine Charlie Watts on drums, and Jagger out front. They'd also got Ian Stewart, who was their keyboard player. He was crucial. Ian Stewart.
Ian Stewart.
He was crucial to their sound.
He
was a brilliant. He was a mate, first of all. He was one of their circle, and he was a brilliant blues boogie woogie style pianist who was critical to their sound. But when they rocked up with Ian Stewart and started playing gigs, the management were going, "You can't have him on the stage. You can't." Have you seen the look of him? He didn't wear long hair. He wasn't a good-looking lad. He was quite weighty. His image was completely wrong. So they said, "You got to get rid of him."
Okay.
So Ian Stewart for years played piano with the Stones at the side of the stage.
The side of the stage. Okay, so we were talking just a minute ago about how identity changed, how hairstyles changed, and clothing, and this, that, and the other. Would it be fair or reasonable to say that around about the same time that those changes happened, that maybe the music industry started becoming more conscious about what was the ideal lad, boy, girl, etc. There started being, because I can remember as a little kid, before '63, in the early '60s, late '50s, seeing singers on telly, and to be honest with you, some of them are tall, some of them are skinny, some of them are big, some of them are this, that, and the other. It didn't matter, because they'd come from their origins were from radio, where you don't see the person, and they'd succeeded because they had a great voice and they were talented. Then they went on to telly, and in the early days of telly, no one seemed to be bothered if you were good, the bad, the ugly, the thin, or grey-haired or whatever. So it seems to be that coming along in the 60s, the era of love and beautiful and all this, that, and the other, that there was more of a kind of fixation on, because you mentioned, who did you mention before, the female model? Twiggy. Okay, Twiggy was supposedly the perfection of what a girl looked like, and so on and so forth. So that's a bit of a sad story, then. It's
business taking control.
It's business taking control, because the Rolling Stones had an extra guy in the band, but maybe he didn't.
He's a brilliant musician.
But his looks didn't click. So the music industry, the manager would say, "Leave him behind the curtain."
Well, get rid of him. They say we get rid of him.
Or get rid of him.
He's integral to our sound. Well, in that case, get him off the stage. I mean, it's really difficult. Really difficult. Another kind of similar aspect to that was Lennon was married by the time. They absolutely burst into prominence, and he wasn't allowed to say that.
He had to keep a secret that he had a wife.
Wouldn't let him say that he was married, because it might impinge on the audience. Well, all the girls might disappear then because Lennon's taken. I mean, it's ludicrous now thinking back, but those were the sort of strictures that the business end of the business. It's show business ultimately. That they're the strictures that were applied, and it was pretty.
That's unfortunate. That's a little bit of a nasty kind of underside to every time we talk about a particular decade, we always find a nasty underside that was hovering along underneath everything.
It's life.
That's unfortunate.
But going back to other artists, I mean, another prominent UK artist who had the first rock and roll number one, I think, was obviously Cliff Richard. He's never written a note in his life. So, and I really didn't like Cliff Richard at all.
No.
Even as a kid, he had his own shows on the TV, and
Yes.
my mum loved him. Oh,
Yeah,
God, not bloody Cliff Richard again. Same sort of things with the Andy Williams kind of thing we talked about, I think.
Yeah.
But so other artists, other prominent artists. Let's think what happened was the Beatles went over to the States in 1964 because their second or third single, had not only gone smash in the UK, but it had gone number one in the States.
Right.
They then went over to the States. They then influenced a lot of people that were working over there.
Right.
And then there started to be that exchange across the Atlantic. First of all, they called it the British invasion because America was desperate, especially with the Beatles were the antidote to what happened in Dallas in 1963 with Kennedy's assassination.
Right.
America was in the doldrums, to say the least, and the Beatles suddenly arrived from the UK with this bright, happy approach. They're four wonderful kids who are funny and irreverent, and they look different, and that began the American. I mean, the legend is that the Beatles' appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show was the most watched for, I think, ever, possibly, with like something like 70 million people watching it on United States, on American TV. And it just created a revolution. So many teenagers watched that show and said, I'm going to do that. And they started bands, and bands started to sprout up with a similar sort of approach to music. So that's where, again, the revolution, it became a two-way thing. American bands started to come over here, the British invasion over there, and it was a conversation at that point.
Yeah. It was interesting because talking about ID and copying, and the Beatles made a couple of films, didn't they? There was Hard Day's Night, there was Help, I can't remember what order they came in, but they made some great films. And then an American production company thought, right, we've got to do that. And based on one of the Beatles films, they created
The Monkees.
The Monkees.
That's right.
Hey, we're the Monkees.
That's
People
right.
say we're Monkey.
Right.
I was going to say, you don't mind if I sing the whole song, do you?
They were great. Manufactured band.
Yeah.
Funny enough, you mentioned your first memory of the Beatles music being at school that first day of school, which is really significant. Mine was, although the music was around and I loved it because I've got an older sister, so she was mad about them. But Mum took us to see A Hard Day's Night out.
Oh, fantastic.
So that was my initiation into the Beatles, kind of Beatlemania, because my sister included, hundreds of girls in the cinema were screaming at the screen. Ridiculous, really.
It used to be like that with me years ago, you know.
Yes, I can well believe it.
You've just reminded me of something as well. It must have been in what was the first time the Beatles went to America? Was that
64?
64, right. 1964, I used to live in Brookdale Road, which was on Smithdown Road.
Yeah, right by Penny Lane, yeah. The
car, when the Beatles came back to the airport, Liverpool Airport, which used to be called Speke Airport because it was in Speke. It's now called John Lennon Airport. Their car drove all the way to the Liverpool Town Hall, and we were all lining Smithdown Road at the top of our street.
Amazing!
And we waved to this big black Rolls Royce, and the Beatles were in the back.
Fantastic!
And everyone turned out. It was fantastic, and everyone was.
So you can actually say you did see the Beatles.
Actually, saw them looking out the window,
That's
kind of thing. Yeah. So that was. Love Me Do 62, and that was 2 years later.
Yeah.
And it was in Liverpool. You couldn't move. Everything was associated and linked to the Beatles.
Yes.
And I tell you what, this is incredible. There used to be a lady called Frida Kelly. She's still around, and she was like a PA, like a secretary to Brian Epstein. And her job. She was in an office in Liverpool city centre. She dealt with all the Beatles fan mail, fan club, managed the fan club.
That's right,
and she lived in our street.
Oh, right. So
and
did you know her?
Yeah, she used to come home and we'd go, hello, Frida, hello,
Amazing.
Frida. And in her handbag, she'd have loads of stuff. Sometimes she'd just give us signed photos of the Beatles. And she had all these envelopes that had come from all over the world. And I used to like collecting postage stamps. So she'd give me all these envelopes, and they'd have postage stamps from America, Canada, Alaska, Japan. And some of them just were addressed just to the Beatles, Liverpool, England,
Of course.
And she used to give me all these. And I had loads of... I should have kept them. They were worth fortune,
you really should.
But you know what? I think 2 years later, England was in the World Cup, and I swapped them all for some bloody football memorabilia.
That's great memories. You should definitely have been worth a fortune today.
Yeah.
But Beatles put Liverpool on the map. There's no,
Absolutely.
there's no doubt about that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And they created a wonderful environment of creativity, which still lives to this day. You're talking about those multiple band bills where you used to go out and see maybe 3 or 4 clubs or pubs, and there'd be a roster of bands on it everywhere you went. We're now in Liverpool. It's still like that today.
Yeah, absolutely,
And the youth are still doing what they were doing back then. Yeah. It's still that creative hub, and I can draw a comparison with places like Birmingham, where if you're a band trying to get off the ground and you want to play your own material, it's difficult.
Yeah, absolutely.
There are no pubs that want to put you on because they want to give a covers band £500 to play a load of covers, basically. So, but in Liverpool, it's a whole different ball game, and venues here want to put bands on that are playing their own stuff. They want to be part of that. It's wonderful. Best city in the world.
There's one thing I was going to ask you, because I remember seeing an old poster. I remember talking to this guy. I can't remember his second name. His name's Joe, and I was talking to him for ages. He's a bit of an artist. He does paintings and drawings. He must be 80. And then he got a photograph out, and he showed me a photograph of these 4 black lads, aged 15, 16, 17, wearing white trousers and white suits, standing on a stage singing. I think it was at a place called Dovedale Towers. And just standing off behind the curtains, you could just see the Beatles. I thought, what the... And he said, we used to support the Beatles. Now, his band was called the Chants.
Yes, absolutely.
A Liverpool band called the Chants.
Absolutely.
And they actually supported the Beatles a few times. They knew them and they chatted to them in and around Liverpool.
Yeah. They were from Liverpool 8.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So what I was thinking was, I'm still thinking that all this the main part of the 60s explosion, the Beatles and so on and so forth, still at this stage in our conversation, we're predominantly talking about white males, aren't we, if I can put it that way?
Primarily.
Yeah.
But so we've really got to think about what were their influences, and then again they were quite different in that they weren't just rock and roll and a little bit of British musical, as I said before, but they were hugely enamoured of the black girl groups that were coming out of Detroit. Right. So we've got to talk about what was going on the side of the Atlantic. And the revolution over there until the Beatles arrived really was in black music. And I think it was 1962, Berry Gordy started up Motown Records in Detroit. And that was where black culture started to concentrate its attention, because it was a massively creative, wonderful business, first of all, studio production facility with the best musicians forming the backing band for all these other people, and the best of writers as well. Right. And we talk about Smokey Robinson started out as an artist but also as the house writer, so he was writing fantastic songs for a lot of other bands that were picking them up and performing. Right. So you started to get bands like the Supremes, the Shirelles, Martha Reeves and the Vandellas, and they were hugely influential on the Beatles' tastes and own material, because they had those 3-part harmonies going all the way through, which the Beatles tried to emulate. And that really made them stand out massively from the competition, who would have one solo singer at the front. Sure. Therefore, that incredible harmony that the 3 front guys created massively made them stand out. So again, the influence of black music. The Chants, of course, with Eddie Amu and his brothers and cousins, they ultimately became the real thing and a massive success story in their own right. But they were hugely popular in Liverpool at that time as well. But you are right. The majority of the success in the UK was primarily white lads in bands. But we've got to talk about that. The culture over time. Really, the youth culture started to combine in a beautiful way. And I think as you move through the 60s, the Beatles start to write much more serious stuff. In 1964, the film comes out, Hard Day's Night. That album that accompanied the film was the first album that they produced, which was full of all their own compositions. Right. And that's the way it then carried on from then on, really. Sure. There was the odd cover here and there, but very few. So their songwriting came to the fore, but they still had those same influences moving forward. So in 65, 66, a lad who'd been a backing musician for Little Richard at one point, the Isley Brothers, other soul bands in the States, and had started to develop a style of guitar playing, which was entirely his own, really. He formed his own band in 66 and started performing in the clubs in New York, around Greenwich Village. And the Animals were on tour, UK, Northeastern R&B band, brilliant band. And their bass player's name was Chas Chandler. And he actually caught this kid playing in the Cafe War in Greenwich Village, and he was just blown away. And the kid's name was Jimi Hendrix. And Chas, he was still playing, as I say, nondescript clubs over there, and still doing largely blues covers and stuff. And Chas grabbed hold of him and said, "You are the future here, as far as I'm concerned. I want you to take you back to Britain." Hendrix hadn't got two pennies to rub together, but he took him back over to the UK, stuck him in the studio in '66, and Hendrix produced a cover to start with, which was "Hey Joe," which was a folk kind of standard. Mm-hmm. And then from then on started writing his own material and came out, and his influences, though he was a black guy, was psychedelic, and his guitar playing was psychedelic. And really, in the form of Jimi Hendrix, the two cultures came together. Right. And the leading light of the rock movement at that point was Jimi Hendrix.
Right. Yeah.
He was the ultimate in guitarists. Yeah, he was a genius, an innovator. And everybody, Eric Clapton, who was at the time, there was graffiti in London on the walls of London saying Clapton is God. Yeah. Not a joke. That's really happened. Yeah. He went to see Hendrix at the Bag of Nails, I think it was, in London, in Soho, and wanted to give up. He wanted to give up. He said, I can't do that. Yeah. I can't do that. And it was a revolution, another revolution, really. The drugs had changed. They'd gone from speed in the early 60s, which the Beatles thrived on because they had to do 12-hour sets or something ridiculous over in Hamburg. That carried them through marijuana. Bob Dylan turned them on to marijuana in 65 when he was on tour over in the UK. Mm-hmm. So that then became the drug of choice. We get Rubber Soul, which is 65 influenced very much by the leaf. Mm-hmm. And then that turns to acid in 66, 67, and that's where psychedelia comes in. Sure, yeah. But more to the point, it was cross-cultural, but mainly from the States, really, and the States bands, they became multicultural bands, which was wonderful. So people like Sly and the Family Stone was a multicultural band. Hendrix had white drummer and bass player to start with. Most significant of all, probably because it's in the South, from Memphis came Booker T and the MGs. Right. Steve Cropper, fantastic lead guitarist and songwriter, white guy. Duck Dunn, legend of a bass player, white guy. Booker T himself, black guy, and Al Jackson on drums, black guy. They were multicultural in Memphis, which was unheard of. You couldn't even go in the same toilets at the time in Memphis. Yeah. So that really was. And then people in Motown, people like Stevie Wonder, who was to start with on the roster. He was a young genius, but he was singing other people's songs primarily. He started to write his own material. Marvin Gaye, who'd been in duos with Tammy Terrell and made his way that way, started to turn on to what was going on really in the world, and started to write anti-war songs and protest songs and talk about the black condition. Sure. And to start with, the business was saying you can't put that out. Right. Berry Gordy didn't want to publish that material, but ultimately became the way forward. So for a beautiful period of time in the late 60s, then you've got a real combining of two cultures in one artistic enterprise and cultural enterprise. Yeah. That was a revolution. Fabulous revolution.
Yeah. So now, looking at it in the context of everything we've just discussed now, me thinking back, I was still a kid in the 60s, of course, but thinking back to how the 60s started and where it ended is phenomenal, really, isn't it? Because it's not even the whole 10 years, because we've already worked out that the 60s, as it were, in terms of the musical reference, didn't really kick in until about 63ish.
That's right.
So you've lost 3 years of the decade.
That's right.
But by 68, 69, it was. I'm just trying to think. What did we get just right at the end? 69.
Woodstock.
Didn't we get the first of the well-known David Bowie stuff? Didn't we get?
Yeah, Space Oddity or it was
Life on Mars.
It was. But 67 was a massive event. The first real festival in Monterey in California.
Right. Yeah.
Monterey Pop, it was called, and the roster was again multicultural.
Sure, yeah.
Hugely successful.
Yeah.
And Hendrix made his first real big impact in the States at the Monterey Festival.
Right.
But Otis Redding was the headliner that night, you know.
Okay.
And in fact, I remember a vinyl album which one of my mates had, which was bizarre in that it was from Monterey. It was called Monterey Pop. On one side was Hendrix, or 5 songs from Hendrix's set.
Yeah.
And on the other side was 5 songs from Otis Redding's set on the same album.
Oh, right.
Amazing.
Okay. Yeah,
absolutely amazing.
Yeah.
So, that was 67. Then through to 69 with Woodstock, which was, again, just the most fantastic cultural event.
Yeah.
But unfortunately, it ends with Altamont in 1969. Which is where the Stones tried to replicate what went on at Woodstock. They made some significant mistakes in the staging of this free festival, again in California. And in the end, it was an absolute disaster.
Yeah.
People died.
Oh, someone was murdered.
One particular person died, was killed. They, for some stupid reason, they employed the local chapter of the Hells Angels to act as their security.
Right.
And if you're employing, that's like putting, a wolf in charge of the chickens. I mean, what on earth are you doing? Employing the most violent organisation known to man at that point in charge of security. It was just a disaster. So yes, unfortunately, Meredith Hunter got stabbed to death right in front of the stage. And it was just absolute hell, a dreadful event, and it was the end of the 60s dream.
Right.
That was the end. It came to a shuddering halt at Altamont in 1969.
Wow. So what a crazy kind of roller coaster the 60s was then.
That's right.
We started off with all these singers called Bobby were.
That's right. Or Cliff.
And then suddenly we went through this crazy revolution where it seemed like loads of the Beatles was a great example, but loads of musicians. The revolution was almost as if it was against the music industry as well.
Yeah, because the artists took over.
The artists took over. We don't want to sing that. We want to sing this.
Right.
And
but that also was, incidentally, that was reflected also in the cinema industry.
Yeah. And didn't the Beatles at one point, didn't they have their own... They started... Well, Apple, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Didn't they actually start their own... Yeah.
They were the first people, first
company up altogether
that did that. That's right.
Yeah.
But what else was going on? Vietnam was massively important to the culture of the time.
Sure.
And even Muhammad Ali said, "I'm sorry, but I'm not going somewhere to kill yellow people for white people. What are you talking about? I'm not doing that." And that was an incredibly brave stance from somebody who was again a cultural icon at the time.
Sure.
And became even more than that ultimately. But Vietnam was the subject of so many violent protests. People were killed in 1968 on one of the campuses in the States. Young children, effectively, young students who were just protesting against the war. And for some strange reason, the governor of the state brought in the National Guard and they opened fire on these peaceful students who were protesting the war. It was a really massive cultural maelstrom, really. And also there were riots in the black parts of many cities during that time as well, who were rioting against their conditions, living conditions, against their, the whole apartheid that was in place in a lot of America even then,
Yeah.
It was an absolutely revolutionary time right across the board, all of society. And I think the one continuity was that youthful awakening and flowering of youthful consciousness, spirituality, love and peace, and literally across all of society with no exceptions. Indian music had started to influence our music, particularly through the Beatles, again by George Harrison, you know. So everybody was welcome. And that was met with reciprocally from black culture as well, you know. It was wonderful, a wonderful time. But unfortunately it ended at Altamont in 69.
Gosh. And to think that, you know, so many of the musicians in the 60s, who might have been aged in the 20s, had been born in or just at the end of the Second World War.
In the war, during the war.
And they must have spent all that time growing up, living with parents and grandparents. It was still bloody traumatised.
You and I can sympathise with that.
Yeah.
Both of my grandfathers, I only realised many, many years later, in recent times really, both of my grandfathers were suffering with PTSD without a doubt. And that was from the First World War. So then again, of course, the next generation had to deal with the Second World War and their participation in that.
So some of those young people, I don't know whether there's such a thing as second-hand PTSD, but a lot of what just comes to mind is maybe the childhood of someone like, say, John Lennon, for example. You know, the childhood he experienced when he was born. He was born in 1940, etc. So there must have been loads of people who were hitting the late teens, early mid-20s in the 60s.
That's right.
Who lived as kids through that, and might have lived with depressed parents or grandparents. So it's no wonder, really, in a way, that by the time you get to the mid-60s, they start saying, we don't want to do what we're being told to do by the music industry. We want to do this. We're going to do it.
That's right. And great art.
And great art comes out of that, out of, you know, all the anguish and the PTSD,
well, absolutely, and we can name the songs. I mean, Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, in 68, after those riots where the students were killed. I can't remember which campus it was now. Might have been Berkeley. I'm not sure which one it was. Neil Young wrote Ohio, which is just one of the most incredible rock songs ever produced by anybody. And there are lots of examples of that coming out of that turmoil, and, you know, the government and the conscription that was going on in the States, because kids were being drafted, you know, to go across to Vietnam. And that was a huge influence on attitudes and all sorts of things. So grow your hair long, and go and stick a flower down the end of a rifleman's. And they're great photographs and John Lennon, of course, progressed with his Peace and Love, and Yoko Ono's message of peace and love and universal love, and love is the answer and love is all you need. And some of us still believe that, you know.
Right. So looking back now, I know we were only kids, because, as I said, I started school in 62. Love me do, 62. That's the year I started school. So by the end of the 60s, you know, I was only just like nearly ready to go into secondary school, 10, 11 or something like that. And I'm wondering, and I've got two older siblings, two older brothers. I've spoke to them a little bit, but they're not much older than me, you know. And I can remember having some conversations with some of my uncles who were closer to the late teens, early 20s at the time. So I always wonder, in a fantasy, would I have liked to have been an older, late teens, early 20s person in the 60s?
Right.
Or was I better off just cruising through it as a 6, 7, 8, 9-year-old? I mean, how do you feel about that?
I was massively affected by it.
Right.
Because I got that older sister who was playing the records, buying the records, wearing the mini skirts, and she was this idol to me, like, you know.
Okay.
I was hugely influenced by it. I was hugely influenced by the Beatles. It felt to me, in my little section of society, that we're all waiting to see what they were going to do next.
What they were going to do next,
so I always regretted not being able to see Hendrix play particularly.
Sure.
But I had my own decade, you know. The next decade was, for me, was my growing up and coming of age. The advent of my music, which took over from this music we're talking about, because everything's got a shelf life, you know.
Sure, absolutely.
But bands like Led Zeppelin and heavy rock started to take hold in sort of 68, 69 really. So a whole different kind of style of music in our culture took over. The reins, and bands, lots of bands, Deep Purple, all sorts of bands, Fleetwood Mac were part of that. A whole different style of music. Cream had started it really in 66, 67 with that heavy interpretation of the blues. It became a massive industry in its own right. It started out as underground music actually, because by that point the Beatles were kind of pop really, although they were heavy in their own way. This stuff was much heavier.
Right.
The Beatles died, of course, by 70. And Zeppelin were the juggernaut really that carried on into the 70s from the 60s with massive blues influence, doing blues covers essentially in a lot of cases, but also in their case in point, they were also massively Western European or British folk influence as well. So they were a great contrasting set of influences in their own rights. I love Zeppelin because of their folk influences. I love folk music, loved the singer-songwriters which had started to come to the fore in the late 60s as well. So again, from California was hugely influential from that point of view. We got people like Joni Mitchell, who was actually a Canadian, but ended up in California. We got James Taylor, we'd got so many of them really, a huge plethora. Ultimately, what's his name? American Pie, Don McLean.
Sure, yeah.
Again, coming from that folk kind of end of things, which also was a political movement of its own actually initially, with people like Pete Seeger, who were branded as communists because they had left leanings and they were socialists essentially, and so there was such a melting pot of all sorts of influences. But I love Zeppelin because they did use British folk music as the basis for a lot of their songs, which then became heavy rock maybe at the end, So they've got that quiet beginning and a heavy ending, and they also were influenced by American blues musicians, which was great too. I loved what they did. So they were my band once the Beatles died, really, I think. But that's moving on into the 70s, really. Yeah.
So if we were trying to sum up, I mean, would we agree, would we say that the 60s was the greatest decade in the last 100 years in terms of the history of popular music?
I'd say it was the most revolutionary.
Most revolutionary,
okay.
Yeah. And would you say that it had a lasting impact on the decades that have followed?
I think it echoes today.
And you can still see it.
I believe so, without a doubt.
So if it hadn't been for the 60s and the Beatles and all that stuff that went around it, we'd still all be dancing to Bobby V, wouldn't we?
Probably. What a terrible prospect that is.
Well, thank God for the 60s.
Yes.
Well, I'm exhausted now, and as usual at the end of our talks, I always feel like I've got to lie down, but this couch is too short. I need a longer couch. I need to discuss my contract.
It's been fun, but it's obviously been about much more than just music.
Yeah, I think it's been about almost like, I'm tempted to say it's been about the whole world, man. The whole world. But yes. once you start going into any depth into music, you start drawing in things to do with culture, society, politics,
fashion.
Fashion.
Oh God, whatever.
You can't leave it out.
That's right.
Once you start talking about it, when you're just listening to it, I still think it's all just music, But once you start,
there's one big
talking,
I'll finish on this now. But one other big revolution, of course, was the advent of the dance set.
Oh, the record player! Oh God. Is that the one where you could put about 6 records on? Right. And they fall down one at a time.
That's right.
Oh, yeah.
What about that? The technology? We should have talked to people. We can't now.
But there was a small dance set, which you had to be careful. You could put an LP on it, but never try and close the lid when your LP is on, because it'd close on the LP.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and make sure your cat isn't in the room when your dance set's going around, because it tries to get on. And his claws wrecked the LP.
Well, we started with the dance set, and we ended the decade with hi-fi. Yeah. So another revolution in technology, really. Yeah.
Well, I know it's nearly time to go, Phil. Do you know how I know? I know because the studio audience have fallen asleep. Yes. Yes, exactly. And you're the one that sent me that note, a word with you. Right, okay, time to go. I've been Liam Boom. This has been Professor Phil Beale. Sometimes he likes me calling him Professor. This has been, it's all just music, isn't it? On Liverpool Online Music.
Absolutely.
And we're going to have to say goodbye. But
subscribe, hit the bell, subscribe, get notified when these come out. Yeah,
if you want to knit me some winter underwear, I'm okay with that. Send it in. But no more of these filthy notes from the studio audience, if you don't mind. Except the lady who... That thing about...
Oh, she sent you a phone number,
I can't understand her. She sent me a phone number. It says something about custard flan. And I quite like custard flans, so... That's possibilities here.
Whatever gets you through the night, bro.
In the meantime, it's time for me to put my legs up on this fucking couch, mate.
Signing
You're
off.
on your own. Ta-da, everyone.
Cheers,
Ta-da.
thank you.